Welcome to the story of the sapphire that killed its owner. I'm your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1. The Man Who Fell Without a Sound. It was on the morning of the 15th of February 1896 that I was reminded, not for the first time, that the City of London kept its darkest business for the coldest months. I had risen early, driven from sleep by a draught in the window casement, and was seated by the fire in our Baker Street rooms with a cup of tea and the early edition of the Times when the bell rang below. Holmes had not yet emerged from his bedroom, though I had heard him moving about for the better part of an hour, between cases, and therefore between purposes, which was always a dangerous interval. I heard his step on the landing just as Mrs. Hudson showed Inspector Lestrade into our sitting room. Lestrade looked as though he had not slept. His collar was unevenly fastened, his coat still bore the damp of the night air, and he carried with him that particular expression I had come to recognize over many years. A man who had seen something he could not explain, and had come to the one address in London where discomfort of that kind was taken seriously. "Gentlemen," he said, removing his hat, "I apologize for the hour." "You do not," said Holmes, appearing at the door in his dressing gown with his pipe already lit. "A man who apologizes for his hour does not arrive at it. I'll sit down, Lestrade. You have come from Belgravia, and you have come about a death." Lestrade blinked. "How on earth—" "The mud on your left boot is of a particularity that occurs where the square's drainage channel meets the pavement. I've catalogued it. And you would not have come here at this hour for a burglary." Holmes settled into his chair and drew upon his pipe. "Tell me, who has died?" Lestrade sat. "Lord Geoffrey Ashcombe, found at approximately 10:30 last night by his own night watchman. He had fallen from the balcony outside his private study, second floor, rear of the house. The fall killed him." "Fallen," said Holmes. "Or thrown?" "That is exactly the question, Mr. Holmes." He proceeded to lay out the essentials. Lord Ashcombe, aged 63, a man of considerable standing in financial circles, had retired to his study at 7 o'clock the previous evening, with strict instruction that he was not to be disturbed. At some point between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, he had gone through the balcony doors and over the railing to the flagstones below. The watchman, a man named Cotter, had discovered the body. "The study?" Holmes asked. "Locked from the inside when the servants came up. The balcony doors were standing open. Cold air had been pouring in long enough to chill the room." "And the body?" Lestrade paused here, and I saw something cross his face. Not squeamishness, for Lestrade was well accustomed to death, but a kind of unease that went beyond the professional. He was lying face down on the flagstones, both arms extended. His right hand was clenched shut, so tightly they had difficulty opening it at the mortuary. He reached into his coat and produced a small velvet pouch, which he placed on the table between us. This was inside it. Holmes opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. It was a sapphire, not extraordinarily large, but of a deep and extraordinary blue, the colour of deep water at dusk. It sat in Holmes's hand, with a weight and presence that seemed to exceed its size. Even in the grey morning light of our sitting-room it held the eye. Holmes did not speak for a moment. He turned the stone slowly between his fingers, tilting it toward the window, and then away. I watched his face. There was no theatrical reaction, only a stillness that lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds longer than I would have expected. Then he set it down and folded his hands. "Tell me about the study," he said. Nothing overturned, no sign of struggle. His desk was orderly, save that the chair had been pulled away from the desk toward the window, a decanter of whisky half empty, a glass beside it used, and in the fireplace, burned paper. Someone had been destroying correspondence. "Recently." "Within hours of the death, I should say. The ash was still warm when we arrived. Holmes's eyes were sharp. What of the railing? Sound, chest height on a man of Ashcombe's stature. You would not go over it by stumbling. Then it was deliberate on someone's part. Holmes rose and reached for his coat. Watson, if you would. Lestrade, I presume the house remains secured. I've left Constable Briggs at the door. No one enters or leaves without my say. Very good. Then let us see what Lord Ashcombe's silence has to tell us. The Ashcombe residence stood in one of the quieter squares of Belgravia, a handsome Portland stone house with tall windows and an air of maintained prosperity. A constable admitted us, and we were led to the staircase by the housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Fenton, who bore the disruption with the rigid calm of one who had served in great houses for decades and would not be shaken by anything so vulgar as sudden death. Holmes asked her nothing yet. He wanted the room first. The study was on the second floor, facing the rear garden, bookshelves to the ceiling, a mahogany desk positioned centrally, and a leather armchair drawn conspicuously away from the desk toward the balcony doors, which still stood open. Cold air moved through the room. The curtains swayed faintly. Holmes stood in the doorway for a full minute before entering. His eyes moved from point to point with a rapidity I could follow but never match. The desk, the chair, the fireplace, the decanter, the balcony. He went first to the fireplace. He crouched and examined the ashes with a lens, extracting 2 fragments of paper and holding them to the light. One bore a few words in a hand I could not read. Holmes pocketed both without comment. Next, the desk. It was orderly, as Lestrade had said. Writing implements, a blotting pad, an appointment diary placed squarely at the corner. No letters visible, no note. Holmes leafed through the diary's final pages, pausing at 2 entries before returning it. Then the chair. It had been pulled a full 4 feet from the desk. The carpet showed drag marks, deep ones, and as though moved with force or impatience. He moved it himself, he murmured. The marks are consistent with a seated man pushing backward with his feet, not with the chair being pulled by another. He looked toward the balcony. He wanted to face that direction. The balcony? Or the night, or whatever was in his hands. He moved to the balcony. The railing was iron, painted black, rising to a height that would strike a man of average build at the sternum. Holmes leaned upon it and peered over. Below, the flagstones of a small courtyard were visible, a fall of perhaps 25 feet. No scuffing on the rail, Holmes said. No fabric caught on the ironwork. He did not struggle. He straightened and looked back into the room. A man does not fall from such a height without sound, Watson. Not if he is surprised. Not if he resists. You think he jumped? I think he did not cry out. A man who is startled screams. A man who is thrown struggles. A man who goes willingly goes quietly. He paused. But I am not yet persuaded that willingness is the whole of it. He returned inside and turned to Lestrade. I should like to speak with the watchman, the secretary, and anyone who saw Lord Ashcombe after 6 o'clock yesterday evening. I should also like the name of his physician. He drew the sapphire from his pocket and held it in the grey light from the balcony doors. Again I saw that hesitation. He tilted the stone slowly, watching its interior. In the flat winter light the effect was muted, but even so, I caught something, a faint pulse within the blue as though the colour were breathing. It was a peculiar sensation, and I found myself watching rather longer than I intended and looked away with effort. Holmes set it down on the desk. Lestrade, he said, has this stone been examined? By our man at the yard. He says it is a genuine sapphire of Kashmir origin, probably cut decades ago. Valuable, but not spectacularly so. Why? Because I am not certain it was meant to be valuable. I believe it was meant to be looked at. He turned to the open balcony doors and the grey sky beyond. A man who falls without a sound has not been surprised, Watson. He has been finished. The question is not what pushed him. It is what held his gaze while his courage failed. I confess that at the time I did not fully comprehend his meaning. A wealthy man, a troubled evening, a fall from height. Such things were tragic, but hardly inexplicable. Holmes, I could see, oft thought otherwise. "This is not an accident," he said, as we descended the staircase, "nor simple self-destruction. There is design in this room, in the chair's position, in the burned letters, in the open doors, in the stone clenched so tightly that rigour alone could not account for it." He paused on the landing. "This man was killed, but the hand that killed him may never have entered the house." Mrs. Fenton was waiting in the hall below. Holmes stopped before her and spoke with a gentleness I had not expected. "Mrs. Fenton, how long had Lord Ashcombe been unwell?" She stiffened. "I would not say unwell, sir." "Then what would you say?" She considered this for several seconds, and I saw the discipline of years at war with the honesty that proximity to death sometimes compels. "Changed," she said at last. "Oh, these past several weeks he was changed, sleeping poorly, short with the staff, which was unlike him. He took to burning letters, private letters, without return address, and he sat alone in the study for hours, with the lamps turned very low." She paused. "I saw him once through the door, holding something blue and turning it by the light. He sat so still I thought he had died in the chair." "How long ago was that?" 10 days, perhaps a fortnight." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenton. You have been more helpful than you know." We stepped out into the February air. The square was quiet. London went about its morning as though nothing had changed within these walls. "Well, Watson," said Holmes, lighting his pipe and turning his collar against the cold, "we have a dead man who fell without a cry. A stone that holds the eye, letters burned but not forgotten, and a household that watched its master decline for weeks without knowing why." He exhaled smoke into the morning. "A silent fall is often more terrible than a violent one. It suggests not surprise, but surrender." He was quiet for a time as we walked, then almost to himself, "But surrender to what?" Chapter 2. A Catalogue of the Quietly Dead. Holmes did not speak again until we had returned to Baker Street. He removed his coat, filled his pipe, and settled into his chair with the air of a man preparing to be still for a considerable time. I knew this mood. It meant he was not merely thinking, but constructing, assembling a framework in which each new fact would find its place. I busied myself with the fire and waited. "Watson," he said at last, "how many ways can a man die that require no one else to be in the room? Suicide, accident, natural causes, a seizure, a stroke, a failure of the heart. And if none of those quite satisfies, then someone was in the room after all. Or someone arranged the room long before the death and was never required to enter it." He drew on his pipe. "I should like you to do something for me. Go to the reading room at the British Museum, and then to the newspaper archives at Colindale. I want every recorded death in the past 5 years in which a sapphire, or any unusual bluestone, was found among the personal effects of the deceased. And I want particular attention to deaths ruled accidental or self-inflicted among men of means over the age of 50. You believe there are others. I believe that Lord Ashcombe did not fall from that balcony because of a single bad evening. Whatever killed him had been working for weeks. And a method refined to that degree is not tried once. It is practiced. I spent the better part of 2 days in archives, newspaper rooms, and coroner's registers. Holmes conducted his own research through channels I was not privy to. I returned one afternoon to find our sitting room carpeted with old copies of the Gazette, the Financial Times, and trade directories for Hatton Garden. He had also obtained partial police records for 4 cases spanning 1892 to 1895. On the third evening he laid the results before me as though presenting a patient's chart. 4 men, Watson, all dead, all alone when they died, all men of wealth, age and standing, and all found with the same stone, or one so alike as to be indistinguishable. He set down a sheet on which he had written the names in his precise, angular hand. Sir Malcolm Drury, 61 at death, a ship owner with South African trade interests, found in the Thames near Blackfriars in the autumn of 1892, having left his club late at night. Accidental drowning while intoxicated, officially. The waterman who recovered the body noted one unusual item among the effects, a blue stone in a small leather case tucked into an inner pocket. It was catalogued and not remarked upon. He moved to the next. Alderman Horace Pelham, 63, a city man, committees, boards, charitable trusts. In the spring of 1894, he stepped from a platform at Paddington into the path of a slow-moving goods train. Witnesses said he seemed not to hear the warning shouted at him. Suicide was the verdict, though his family contested it. A sapphire in a waistcoat case was found among his effects at the inquest. Colonel James Whitford, 59, retired military, long service in India. In the spring of 1895, he fell from a highland path during a solitary walking excursion. The path was narrow, but not treacherous. The weather was clear. Misadventure. A sapphire wrapped in tissue was found in his rucksack. His family did not recognize it as his. Holmes paused at the fourth name, and I saw something sharpen in his expression. Not excitement, but recognition of a thing that confirmed a theory he had not yet shared. Mr. Archibald Fenwick, 65, a retired financier of strict routine and considerable self-control, found dead in his study in the autumn of 1895 from laudanum ingestion. The scene, Watson, is where the pattern ceases to be merely suggestive and becomes eloquent. How so? His desk lamp was still burning. His chair had been pulled directly before the mirror over the mantelpiece, a heavy thing, oak-framed, that would normally reflect the room behind the desk. He had moved the chair so that a seated man would face his own reflection. The sapphire lay on a stack of scorched letters beside an uncapped pen. The blotting paper before him showed repeated pen strokes pressed so hard they had torn through the sheet. No note was found. No message. Only the evidence of a man who had tried to write something and could not. I stared at the paper. 4 deaths. 4 solitary deaths. 5, counting Ashcombe. Holmes rose and went to the mantelpiece, where the sapphire now rested in a dish. Consider what unites them. Not the manner of death, that varies completely. Drowning, a railway, a fall, laudanum, a balcony. If these men were killed by a single hand, that hand chose a different instrument each time. And yet the condition is always identical. Each man was alone. Each man was in a state of distress or agitation in the days preceding his death. Each man was found with this stone, or one made to the same design. Could there be more than one stone? There could, but the descriptions match closely enough. The size, the colour, the unusual depth of blue, that I believe it is a single object, returning again and again to the hands of men who do not survive the holding of it. Then the stone itself is not the killer, Watson. That is the trap our minds wish to set. He picked up the sapphire and held it between thumb and forefinger in the lamplight. A stone does not drown a man, or push him beneath a train, or pour laudanum into a glass. What it can do, what this one was made to do, is hold his attention at the worst possible moment. But the worst possible moment must first be arranged. He set it down again and returned to the table. Consider Fenwick's study. A man seated before his own mirror with letters burning in the grate, and a pen he cannot bring himself to use. That is not the scene of a man surprised by despair. It is the final act of a drama that has been building for weeks. Someone wrote to Fenwick. Someone sent him letters that reopened wounds he thought were closed. And then someone sent him the stone and left him alone with it. The burned letters, I said. Ashcombe burned letters too. Precisely. And the chair drawn toward the window, toward the light, toward the balcony, away from the desk where a man conducts his ordinary business. Both Fenwick and Ashcombe, in their final hours, turned away from their lives and toward something else. The stone was the object, but the letters were the blade. He stood at the window for a time, looking down into Baker Street. A cab rattled past. The lamplighter was making his rounds. "The vulgar murderer repeats his hand," he said, without turning. A subtler one repeats only his condition. What condition? Solitude, guilt, and a mirror, literal or otherwise, in which the victim cannot avoid his own reflection. I confess the picture disturbed me. I had accompanied Holmes through cases of violence and cunning, but there was something in this that felt different. A man who strangles or shoots must at least be present for the act, but a killer who arranges the conditions of death and then withdraws, who needs never see the body or hear the cry, that seemed to me a colder thing than murder itself. "There is one more element," Holmes continued. "The victims share more than age and station. I've spent this afternoon examining trade directories, partnership records, and financial registers for 1870 to 1880. All 5 men, Drury, Pelham, Whitford, Fenwick, and Ashcombe, appear in connection with South African mining interests during that period. The specific venture is not yet clear, but the association is not coincidental. Then the motive is old. The motive is ancient, Watson, and the patience behind it is extraordinary. Whoever is doing this has waited 20 years. He has watched these men live out their comfortable lives, and then, one by one, he has reached into those lives and made them unendurable." He fell silent. I watched the firelight move across his sharp features and thought I saw something I rarely observed in Sherlock Holmes. Not admiration, he was too moral for that, but a kind of austere respect for the intelligence of an adversary who had, until this moment, operated entirely without detection. "We are looking," he said at last, "for a man of exceptional patience, exact knowledge, and a grievance so deep that 20 years have not cooled it. He is educated. He understands optics, gemcraft, and the structure of guilt. He knows these men, not as the public knows them, but as they know themselves, and he has found a way to kill without ever needing to be present at the death. Where do we begin? With the stone. It is the one constant, the artist's signature. If I can understand how it was made, I may understand who made it. And if I can understand the old business that bound these 5 men together, I will understand why." He reached for the sapphire once more, turning it slowly in the firelight. The blue seemed to pulse faintly, a trick of the moving flame, I told myself, though I noticed I did not wish to look at it for long. "Tomorrow," said Holmes, "we shall visit Hatton Garden. There is a dealer in rare stones whose name appears in 3 of these cases, a man called Rajiv Nair. He is said to be expert, well-connected, and unusually knowledgeable about the provenance of unusual gems." He paused. "He is also, by an interesting coincidence, the man through whom this sapphire has returned to circulation after more than one of these deaths." "You suspect him?" Holmes considered this. "I suspect that Mr. Nair knows a great deal more about this stone than he has ever been asked. Whether that knowledge extends to murder is a question I prefer to answer in his presence, where I may observe what his face does when the subject of dead men arises." He set the sapphire down in its dish and rose. 5 men, Watson. 5 solitary deaths. a 5 times the same blue stone found among the effects of a man who died without witness and without sound. The police saw 5 separate tragedies. I see a single hand, invisible, patient, and terribly precise. He knocked the ash from his pipe and turned toward his bedroom. Sleep well, old friend. Tomorrow we enter the world of beautiful things and the ugly purposes they sometimes serve. Chapter 3. The Dealer of Beautiful Lies. Hatton Garden, on a cold morning, has a character quite unlike the rest of London. The street is narrow, the shop fronts modest, and the men who move between them carry fortunes in their waistcoat pockets, with no more ceremony than a clerk carries a pencil. It is a place where trust and caution exist in equal measure, and where reputation, once lost, is never recovered. Rajiv Nair's premises occupied the first floor above a diamond broker's office, reached by a steep and well-worn staircase. The door was unassuming, dark wood, a brass plate engraved simply with the name Nair, and beneath it, in smaller letters, rare stones and unusual provenance. Holmes knocked once, and we were admitted by a young clerk into a reception room that was, by contrast, anything but modest. The walls were lined with glass cases displaying gems lit by precisely angled gas jets. The carpet was Persian. The chairs were leather. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood. Everything in the room said, "Here is a man who understands value and knows how to present it." Rajiv Nair appeared from a rear office within moments. He was perhaps 45, dark-haired, clean-shaven, dressed in a suit of excellent English cut. His manner was warm without being effusive, his handshake firm, his smile calibrated to convey welcome without over-familiarity. He was a man who had mastered the art of charm so thoroughly that it no longer appeared to be art at all. "Mr. Holmes," he said, gesturing us to chairs. "I confess I am not entirely surprised. Lord Ashcombe's death has been much discussed in the trade, and the stone found with him was, well, it was known to me." "Known how?" said Holmes. "I've handled it. Twice, perhaps 3 times over the years. It is a Kashmir sapphire of unusual quality. The colour is distinctive, as you will have observed. Deep, saturated, with a character I have not seen matched in any other stone of its size. And the history." Nair paused. Not long, a fraction of a second, but Holmes would have marked it. "The history is colourful," Nair said carefully. "Such stones attract stories. Clients enjoy a sense of drama, the curse of this, the legend of that. I have never discouraged such associations because, frankly, Mr. Holmes, a stone with a reputation commands a premium that a stone without one does not. That is commerce, not conspiracy. And this particular reputation, that it brings misfortune to its owners, that men who possess it do not possess it long." He spread his hands. "I did not invent the story. I merely did not correct it." Holmes studied him for a moment. "How did the stone come to you?" "The first time, through an estate sale. Drury's, though I did not know the connection then. The second, through an intermediary I no longer recall. The third, after Fenwick's death. It was brought to me by an anonymous seller through a broker in Cheapside. Each time I cleaned it, assessed it, and offered it for private sale." "To whom?" "To collectors, dealers in other cities. The stone has a way of circulating. It appears, sells, vanishes, reappears." "And you never thought this pattern unusual?" "I thought it excellent for business, Mr. Holmes." There was a frankness in this that I found almost disarming. Nair was admitting, with a shopkeeper's pragmatism, that he had profited from death and reputation alike. Whether this candour was genuine or itself a form of concealment, I could not tell. Holmes shifted his approach. "You mentioned that the stone was known to you. Were the men who died also known to you?" "Some. Drury was a client. He purchased several pieces from me over the years. Pelham. I knew only by reputation. Whitford not at all. Fenwick visited my shop once, perhaps twice, though he bought nothing of consequence. And Ashcombe, yes, Lord Ashcombe was a collector. Not a passionate one, but a man who appreciated fine things and could afford them. Did you sell the Sapphire to Ashcombe? No, I do not know how it came to him. That is the truth. Holmes accepted this without visible reaction. Mr. Nair, I should like to ask you about a member of your staff, or perhaps a consultant, an elderly gentleman. I understand you employ someone with expertise in antique cuts and optical properties of stones. Something changed in Nair's expression. Not alarm, but a slight recalibration, as though he had expected the conversation to continue in one direction, and Holmes had turned it in another. "You are thinking of Mr. Ellsworth," he said. "Julian Ellsworth. He's not staff exactly, a retired optician who advises me on cut quality, light behaviour, and the assessment of older stones. Extremely knowledgeable." "How long has he advised you?" "Several years. He comes and goes, appears when a piece interests him, examines it, offers his opinion and departs. I pay him a small consulting fee." "Is he here today?" "As it happens, yes. He arrived half an hour before you did. He is in the back room examining a parcel of old cut garnets." Holmes asked that he be brought in, and Nair sent the clerk. We waited in silence. I occupied myself by examining a tray of loose emeralds beneath the nearest glass case. Holmes sat perfectly still with his fingers steepled. The man who entered was not what I expected, and I had formed no definite picture, but I suppose I imagined someone vigorous, a man whose expertise suggested force of intellect. Instead, Mr. Julian Ellsworth was slight, grey-haired, and softly spoken. He wore a plain brown suit of old but careful make, steel-rimmed spectacles, and an expression of mild, patient courtesy. He was the sort of man one might sit beside on an omnibus, and forget entirely by the next stop. "Mr. Holmes," he said, inclining his head. "Mr. Nair mentioned you might visit. A terrible business, Lord Ashcombe." "You knew him?" "Only by name, the sort of name one reads in the financial columns." He took the chair Nair offered and folded his hands in his lap. "I understand a sapphire was found with him, Mr. Nair tells me it may be the same stone I have examined here on previous occasions." "And what was your assessment of it?" Ellsworth considered the question with the air of a man who takes precision seriously. "An exceptional stone. Kashmir origin, almost certainly. The colour is remarkable, a depth of blue that is not merely saturated but somehow active. The cut is unusual, not modern, and not quite antique in the conventional sense. Whoever shaped it understood light in a way that went beyond decorative faceting." "Could you say more about that?" "Only that the internal geometry produces an effect I have not encountered in any other stone. Under certain conditions, low, warm light, a candle or a gas jet, the blue seems to shift, to pulse almost. It is a quality of the cut, not of the mineral itself. Quite deliberate, I should think." Holmes nodded slowly. "You say deliberate. You believe the cutter intended this effect?" "I believe the cutter was an artist of unusual ability and very particular purpose. Stones reveal very little by themselves, Mr. Holmes. It is the eye that supplies the rest." I thought this an odd remark, more philosophical than the occasion seemed to require, but Holmes merely inclined his head as though it confirmed something he already suspected. At that moment, Nair, who had been listening from the doorway, mentioned Ashcombe's death again in passing, some remark about the inconvenience of police inquiries disrupting the trade. Ellsworth turned to him with a quiet question that I almost missed. "Was he alone when he died?" Nair said he believed so. Ellsworth nodded once, as if this were the answer he expected, and returned his attention to Holmes with no further comment. The question was so natural, so lightly delivered, that I scarcely marked it at the time. It was only later, much later, that I understood what it meant. Holmes asked several more questions about the stone's commercial history, received careful answers from both men, and rose to leave. Ellsworth stood as well and shook Holmes's hand, with the mild grip of a man who wished to leave no particular impression. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Holmes," he said, "though I confess I have always thought that objects such as these carry less blame than we wish to assign them. It is a comfortable thing to blame a stone. It spares us the trouble of blaming a man." We descended the staircase in silence. Outside, the cold air of Hatton Garden struck us, and Holmes turned up his collar. "Well," I said, "what do you make of Nair?" "A man who profits from ambiguity and is clever enough to know precisely how much truth to offer in order to seem cooperative. He is concealing something, the extent of his knowledge about the stone's return pattern at the very least. But I am not yet certain he is concealing murder." "And Ellsworth?" Holmes was quiet for a few paces. "An interesting man," he said, "retired, mild, forgettable. And yet he noticed us before we noticed him. He was seated in that back room with the door open and a clear line of sight to the entrance. A man who wishes merely to examine garnets does not position himself so." "You think he was expecting us?" "I think he was expecting someone. Whether that is the same thing remains to be seen." He paused at the corner and looked back toward Nair's shop. "Did you mark his question, Watson, when Nair mentioned Ashcombe's death?" "He asked whether Ashcombe was alone." "Yes. Not how he died. Not when. Not whether foul play was suspected. Only whether he was alone." Holmes turned and began walking. It is the question of a man who already knows the answer to everything else. We found a tea room nearby and sat in a window booth. Holmes ordered nothing and stared at the street. "3 men interest me now," he said. "Nair, who handled the stone and allowed its legend to flourish. Ellsworth, who understood its construction better than anyone and asked the one question that matters. And a 3rd man, one we have not yet met." "Who?" "Douglas Hale. Lord Ashcombe's private secretary. He delivered the Evening Post on the night of the death, and Lestrade tells me he was evasive when asked what it contained." Holmes tapped the table once. "The stone did not arrive by itself, Watson. Something accompanied it, and someone in that household knows what it was." Chapter 4. The Last Evening of Lord Ashcombe. We returned to the Ashcombe residence on the following morning. The house had acquired, in the few days since our first visit, the particular stillness that settles upon a household after death. Not grief, precisely, but a suspension of ordinary rhythm, as though the mechanism of daily life had been halted mid-stroke, and no one yet knew how to restart it. Mrs. Fenton admitted us with the same composed manner as before. Holmes had sent word ahead, requesting interviews with the household staff and with Mr. Douglas Hale, Lord Ashcombe's private secretary. Lestrade, who met us in the entrance hall, reported that Haley had agreed to be present, but had seemed, in the inspector's words, unwilling without quite being uncooperative. "An interesting distinction," Holmes remarked. We began with the servants. Holmes spoke to each in the morning room, briefly and without pressure, and I recorded their answers. The picture that emerged was consistent and troubling. The cook, Mrs. Lennox, confirmed that Lord Ashcombe's appetite had declined markedly over the preceding 3 weeks. He had taken to eating alone and sending plates back barely touched. She recalled one evening, perhaps 10 days before the death, when she had brought a tray to the study door and heard him speaking aloud, though no visitor had been admitted. She could not make out the words, only the tone, which she described as arguing with himself or with a letter. The housemaid, Annie Garrett, had been responsible for cleaning the study each morning. She confirmed that burned paper appeared in the grate with increasing frequency in the final fortnight. On 2 occasions she had found fragments that had not fully burned. She had swept them into the ashpan without reading them, as was her habit, though she recalled that the paper was of good quality and the handwriting small and careful. She also mentioned that the wastepaper basket beside the desk had contained, on the morning after one such burning, a torn envelope with no return address and a faint impression where a seal or object had pressed against the paper from inside. Holmes's eyes sharpened at this, though his voice remained casual. An impression, as though something had been enclosed? Yes, sir. Round, like a coin, but smaller. And the envelope itself? Gone with the rest, sir. I emptied the basket as always. Holmes thanked her and moved on. The valet, Simmons, had attended Lord Ashcombe on the evening of his death. He confirmed the timeline we already possessed. The dinner with Miss Clara Ashcombe at 5 o'clock, her departure at 6:30, Dr. Frith's brief visit at 7, and the retirement to the private study shortly after. Simmons had laid out Ashcombe's nightclothes and left a carafe of water on the bedroom table. He had not entered the study. "How did his lordship seem when you last saw him?" Holmes asked. Simmons hesitated. He was a precise man, neat in dress and careful in speech, and I could see him weighing accuracy against loyalty. "Distressed, sir," he said at last. He had been drinking more than was usual. His hands were not steady. He spoke very little, but when he did it was in fragments, half-sentences, as though he were continuing a conversation that had been going on inside his head for some time. Did he mention any names? Any subject? Only once, sir. As I was leaving, he said, and I believe these were his exact words, "It is too late for settlements." I did not understand it. I said good night and closed the door. Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Simmons. You have an excellent memory." Douglas Hale received us in the small library adjoining the study. He was a man of about 35, lean, carefully dressed, with the guarded attentiveness of someone whose profession required him to anticipate the needs and moods of another person at all times. He sat with his hands flat on the table and answered Holmes's opening questions with the clipped efficiency of a man giving evidence he had already rehearsed. Yes, he had been Lord Ashcombe's secretary for 8 years. Yes, he handled correspondence, appointments, and estate business. Yes, he had delivered the evening post on the night of the death at approximately 9 o'clock, as was his custom. "What did the post contain?" Holmes asked. "The usual matters, invitations, a bill from the wine merchant, a letter from Lord Ashcombe's solicitor regarding a property matter. And nothing else?" The pause was fractional, a single beat of hesitation before Haley answered. "Nothing I recall specifically." Holmes let the silence extend. I'd seen him use this technique before, not pressing, but simply allowing the quiet to do its work. Most men, given enough silence, will fill it. Haley was more disciplined than most, but even he shifted in his chair. "Mr. Haley," Holmes said at length, "I should tell you plainly that I'm investigating Lord Ashcombe's death, not as an accident, but as a possible crime. I believe that in the weeks preceding his death, Lord Ashcombe received a series of anonymous letters designed to cause him severe psychological distress. I believe that on the night he died, or one such letter arrived, the final one, and that it was accompanied by an object. I believe that letter was part of the evening post you delivered." Haley's face did not change, but his hands, which had been flat on the table, slowly curled inward. "I also believe," Holmes continued, "that you opened that letter before delivering it." The room was very quiet. I could hear the clock on the mantelpiece and the faint sound of a maid moving in the corridor beyond. "I did not open it," Haley said. His voice was steady, but his eyes had gone still in the way a man's eyes go still when he is calculating rapidly. The envelope was not fully sealed. The flap had come loose. Whether in transit or by poor adhesive, I could not say. I saw the edge of the contents. I read a line, perhaps 2. "And what did you read?" "Enough to know it was not a business letter." He paused. "It was... threatening is not quite the word. It was cold. It spoke of debts and of a family that had been destroyed. I did not understand it. I assumed it was the work of a disgruntled former associate, and you delivered it anyway. It was not my place to withhold Lord Ashcombe's correspondence. Even correspondence you believed to be harmful? Haley met Holmes's gaze directly for the first time. Mr. Holmes, Lord Ashcombe had received letters of that nature before. I had seen them in the post over several weeks, always the same plain envelope, the same small hand, no return address. I never opened any of the others. I delivered them because it was my duty to deliver them. What his lordship did with his correspondence was his affair. And what he did, Holmes said, was burn them. Yes. Everyone? Everyone I'm aware of. Holmes rose and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Haley for a long moment. When he turned, his tone had changed, not harsh, but precise in a way that permitted no evasion. Mr. Hale, I understand that Lord Ashcombe recently discovered irregularities in the management of certain estate accounts. The colour left Hale's face. It happened slowly, like a tide withdrawing, and I watched it with the clinical detachment of a physician who has seen the same physiological response 100 times in men confronted with an unexpected truth. I see Lestrade has been thorough, Haley said quietly. Lestrade mentioned nothing. The appointment diary on Lord Ashcombe's desk contained an entry, 3 days before his death, reading H. Accounts. Resolve. The notation was underlined twice. It did not require great imagination to interpret. Haley was silent for several seconds. It is true, he said. Over a period of years I diverted small sums from the household accounts. Never large amounts, never enough to attract immediate notice. Lord Ashcombe discovered the discrepancy a fortnight before his death. He told me I would be dismissed without reference at the end of the month. A man facing ruin, Holmes observed, might wish his employer would not live to carry out the sentence. I did not kill Lord Ashcombe, but you delivered the letter that may have done so, and you did it knowing it would cause him pain. Holmes picked up his hat from the table. That is not murder, Mr. Hale, but it is not innocence either. We left Haley sitting alone in the small library. His hands had returned to the table, but they were no longer still. In the carriage returning to Baker Street, Holmes was occupied with his own thoughts. I waited until we had crossed the park before speaking. Do you believe him? About the accounts? Entirely. About the letter? Largely. He read more than a line or two. His knowledge of the content was too specific for a passing glance. But I do not believe he understood the full significance of what he carried. He is a man who delivered a weapon without knowing it was loaded. Could he have written the letters himself? He had motive. If Ashcombe were dead, the dismissal would never take effect. He had motive, yes, but the letters predate his crisis by many weeks, and they reference matters that go back a quarter of a century. Haley is 35 years old. Whatever destroyed Lord Ashcombe began long before Douglas Hale entered his service. Holmes stared out at the passing street. No, the hand that wrote those letters is older, more patient, and more exact. But Haley has given us something valuable nonetheless. What? Confirmation. The letters and the stone arrived together. The final letter was the culmination of a campaign, not a single act. And the hand that delivered it may not know what it carried, but something entered that room before death did. He fell quiet again. Then, almost as an afterthought, we must see Clara Ashcombe next, Watson, the daughter who dined with her father on the evening he died, and who, I'm now informed, I removed something from his study before the police arrived. Removed what? That, said Holmes, is precisely the question. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Knew Too Much. Clara Ashcombe lived in a modest flat above a bookseller's shop in Bloomsbury. The address itself told a story. A woman of good family and reasonable education, living on an allowance that permitted dignity but not luxury, at a distance from Belgravia that was not merely geographical. She admitted as herself. There was no maid, no servant, only a small sitting room with bookshelves, a writing desk, and a window that looked over the rooftops toward the museum. She was 28, slight, dark-haired, with a composure that struck me less as natural calm than as a discipline practiced so long it had become indistinguishable from temperament. She offered tea. Holmes declined. I accepted, because experience had taught me that a person pouring tea is a person whose hands are occupied, and occupied hands often accompany unguarded speech. "Miss Ashcombe," Holmes began, "I shall be direct. I am investigating your father's death, and I believe you can help me. I also believe you removed something from his study on the evening he died, before the police arrived." She did not flinch. She set down the teapot, folded her hands, and regarded Holmes with an expression I could not entirely read. Not defiant, not guilty, but watchful, as though she were assessing how much truth the situation required. "I did," she said. "I removed a letter." "From his desk?" "From beneath a paperweight on the corner of his desk, yes. I found it that afternoon when I arrived for dinner. Father was not yet in the study. I saw the letter, read the first lines, and understood enough to know that if the police found it, the consequences for my family's name would be severe." "You read it in full?" "I did." "And you have it still?" She rose without a word, went to the writing desk, and from a locked drawer produced a folded sheet of paper. She held it for a moment before surrendering it. Not reluctance, I thought, but the awareness that once given it could not be taken back. Holmes unfolded it. I moved closer and read it over his shoulder. The letter was written in a small, precise hand on plain paper of good quality. There was no greeting, no signature. It read, "You will remember what was done. You remember the name. You remember the shop in Cheapside, and the man who stood in your office with his accounts in his hand, asking for the help that was owed to him. You remember that you gave him words, fine words, sympathetic words, and nothing else. His shop was taken, his home was taken, his name was taken. He died with nothing, and his wife followed him within the year. Your comfort was purchased where another man's name was buried. You have carried this debt for 23 years. The interest has come due." There was a pause in which neither Holmes nor I spoke. The letter was not violent. It contained no explicit threat, and yet it was, in its cold precision, among the most disturbing documents I had ever read. It did not rage. It remembered. And memory in that tone was worse than any threat. "When did this arrive?" Holmes asked. "I cannot say exactly. Father had been receiving letters of this kind for some weeks. I did not know this until after his death, when the servants told me. This particular letter was already on his desk when I arrived that afternoon. Whether it came that morning or the day before, I do not know. It was not the final letter," Holmes said. "Another arrived that evening with the post, the one that accompanied the Sapphire." Clara's eyes widened slightly. There was more than one. At least two in the final days, possibly three. The campaign had been building for weeks. He folded the letter and placed it inside his coat. "Miss Ashcombe, the letter refers to a man whose shop was in Cheapside, whose name was taken, who died in poverty. Do you know who is meant?" "I did not when I first read it. But after Father died, I went through his private papers. There is a strong box in his bedroom that I had never seen opened. I found the key among his effects and opened it." She paused. Inside were documents relating to a mining syndicate from the early 1870s. 5 partners, my father among them. The venture failed. The losses were restructured so that one man bore the worst of it. His name was Absalom Vane. She spoke the name quietly, but it landed in the room with a weight I felt physically. Vane lost everything, she continued. His business, his home, his credit, his standing. He died within 2 years. I found a letter, not anonymous, but written in my father's own hand, never sent, addressed to a Mr. Elias Vane, the son. It was an apology. It was not recent. The ink was faded and the paper yellowed. He had written it years ago and never posted it. But he had posted others, Holmes said. Clara nodded. More recently, yes. In the strongbox I found copies of 3 letters, all addressed to Elias Vane, care of various addresses, none of which I suspect were current. The letters were written over the past year. They offered restitution. They offered money, public acknowledgement, and a meeting. The tone was... She stopped. The tone was that of a man who had lived with something for a very long time and could no longer bear it. Holmes was silent for a moment. I watched his face and saw something shift, not surprise, for I believe he had already suspected this, but a deepening of something more complex. A case that had seemed to be about revenge was acquiring a second dimension. Remorse. Your father was trying to find Elias Vane, Holmes said. Yes, and failing. The letters were returned or went unanswered. I do not believe he ever made contact. And you removed the anonymous letter from his desk to prevent this history from becoming public. I removed it to protect my father's memory, Mr. Holmes, and my family's name. The syndicate affair, what was done to the Vane family, is not something I wish discussed in the penny press. It would not bring my father back. It would only make his death into a scandal. It may also, Holmes said gently, make his death into a murder. She met his eyes. I know. There was a long silence. Rain had begun outside, a thin, persistent drizzle that darkened the window and made the little room feel smaller. Miss Ashcombe, I must ask you about the evening itself. You dined with your father at 5 o'clock. Yes, he had invited me. It was unusual. We had not dined alone together in some months. Our relations were not hostile, but they were strained. There had been a quarrel some years ago regarding my mother's will and the terms of my allowance. I will not bore you with the details. It was the ordinary poison of money and pride. How did he seem? Changed. He drank heavily at dinner, which was unlike him in company. He spoke in fragments, disjointed, half-finished sentences. He mentioned old debts and settlements too late to matter. He said at one point that he had written to someone who would not answer, and that the silence was worse than any reply. Did he mention the Sapphire? Not by name, but as I was leaving, he took my hand, which he had not done since I was a girl, and said something I have thought about every hour since. He said, I have been looking at something I cannot put down, Clara, and I am afraid that when I do, there will be nothing left to hold. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. Holmes's expression did not change, but his hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened. What time did you leave? 6:30. I kissed his forehead at the door. He did not rise. And you did not return? No. I went home. I read. I went to bed. The constable came at midnight. Holmes rose. Miss Ashcombe, I am grateful for your honesty. The letter you preserved may be the most important document in this case. I must keep it. I expected that. One more question. You're in the strongbox. The letters your father wrote to Elias Vane, did any of them contain a reply? No, not one. Holmes nodded slowly. We moved toward the door. Clara remained standing by the window, her arms crossed, looking out at the rain. Mr. Holmes, she said, without turning, was my father a good man? Holmes paused with his hand on the door handle. It was not, I think, a question he had expected, and for a moment I saw him weigh his words with a care I associated more with the physician's consulting room than the detective's. He was a man who did a grave wrong in his youth, Holmes said, and who spent his later years trying to undo it. Whether that constitutes goodness, I confess I am not qualified to judge. But I can tell you that whoever killed him knew of his remorse, and was not deterred by it. We descended into the rain. "The picture sharpens, Watson," Holmes said, raising his umbrella. Ashcombe was not merely a victim of old hatred. He was a man reaching toward atonement, writing letters of apology, offering restitution, trying to find the son of the man his syndicate destroyed. And yet the campaign against him continued. The anonymous letters came anyway. The Sapphire came anyway. Then the killer did not care that Ashcombe repented, or he could not stop. A machine, once set in motion, does not pause because its target has changed. He walked in silence for several paces. But there is something else. Clara told us the anonymous letters had been arriving for weeks, and yet Ashcombe's own letters of apology date from the past year. He was reaching out long before the campaign began, which means he stopped. Which means the killer may have received those apologies, he may have read them, and he chose to proceed regardless. That is cold. That is the question, Watson. Was it cold? Or was it something worse, a mechanism that had grown beyond the reach of its maker's conscience? He turned toward Baker Street. "We must now see the physician. Dr. Martin Frith signed the death as accidental with unseemly haste, and I should very much like to know what he is so anxious to conceal." Chapter 6. The Geometry of Unease. I returned to Baker Street the following afternoon to find Holmes in his shirt sleeves at the chemistry table, surrounded by apparatus I did not immediately recognise. The Sapphire sat in a small brass clamp at the centre of the arrangement, positioned between a gas jet on one side and a magnifying lens on the other. Holmes had drawn the curtains so that the only light in the room was the flame itself, a low, steady tongue of yellow that cast deep shadows across the table and made the rest of the sitting room vanish into grey. "Sit down, Watson," he said, without looking up, "and tell me what you see." I drew a chair close and looked at the stone through the lens. Under magnification and gaslight, the sapphire was transformed. The deep blue that had seemed merely beautiful in daylight now revealed an interior architecture of extraordinary complexity. Planes within planes, angles catching and redirecting the light, a facet so precisely arranged that the stone appeared to contain a structure rather than merely reflect one. And then I saw what Holmes meant. The light inside the stone was not still. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic flicker, as though the flame were being interrupted at a regular interval. But the gas jet was steady. The interruption was coming from within the stone itself. As the light passed through its internal geometry, the facets caught and released it in a pattern that produced a faint but persistent oscillation. It was not dramatic. It was not beautiful. It was deeply, quietly wrong. The visual equivalent of a note held slightly too long, or a clock whose tick has fallen fractionally out of true. I found myself staring. The pulse was hypnotic in the oldest sense of that word, not commanding, but absorbing. It drew the eye and discouraged it from leaving. After perhaps 30 seconds, I became aware of a mild strain behind my eyes and a reluctance to look away that required a conscious effort to overcome. I sat back. That is profoundly unpleasant. And profoundly deliberate. Holmes adjusted the gas jet, and the effect vanished. He lit the lamp, and the room returned to normal. What you experienced, Watson, is the product of calculated optical engineering. The stone's internal faceting is designed to produce precisely that effect under low, warm light, gaslight, candlelight, the kind of illumination in which a man sits alone in his study at night. Designed by whom? By a cutter of extraordinary skill who understood not merely the geometry of light, but its effect upon the human eye. The pulsation exploits visual fatigue. When the eye is presented with a rhythmic stimulus it cannot resolve, it fixates, attention narrows. In a man already anxious, sleep-deprived, or under the influence of drink or sedatives, the effect would be considerably more pronounced. You are describing mesmerism. I am describing nothing of the kind. Mesmerism is theatre. This is optics. The stone does not control the mind. It merely holds the eye at the precise moment when the mind is most dangerous to itself. He picked up the sapphire and turned it in his fingers. Consider the conditions. A man has been receiving letters for weeks. Letters that open old wounds, that accuse him, that name his worst secrets. He cannot sleep. He drinks. His doctor gives him bromides. He burns the letters but cannot burn the memory of them. And then, like in the final hours, he sits alone in a darkened room with this stone in his hand, and the light inside it will not let him look away. And then he falls, or steps, or drinks, or walks. The stone does not dictate the manner. It sustains the state. It is not the murder weapon, Watson. It is the murderer's signature, his final instrument, his curtain call. The true weapon has always been the letters. He set the stone down and covered it with a cloth, as though unwilling to let it sit exposed. A man need not be driven mad to be pushed toward ruin, he said. He need only be made unable to look away from the thought most dangerous to him. We visited Dr. Martin Frith that evening, at his surgery in Harley Street. He received us in a consulting room that was immaculate in the way that suggests a man more concerned with the appearance of competence than with competence itself. Every instrument polished, every certificate framed and prominently displayed. Frith was perhaps 50, well-fed, carefully groomed, with the sympathetic manner of a physician whose practice depended more upon wealthy nerves than upon serious illness. He greeted Holmes with the cautious warmth of a man who wished to seem cooperative without committing to anything. "A sad business," he said, settling into his chair. "Lord Ashcombe was my patient for 15 years. A strong constitution, generally speaking, though the last several months had been difficult." "In what way?" Holmes asked. "Agitation, sleeplessness, a general deterioration of nerve. He complained of an inability to rest his mind, a phrase he used more than once. I prescribed bromide of potassium, which is standard for such complaints, and later added a mild sedative tincture for the worst nights." "How much bromide?" Frith hesitated. "A reasonable dose?" "Increased over time. Adjusted. As the symptoms persisted, adjustment was necessary. Dr. Frith, I should like to see your treatment notes for Lord Ashcombe's final 3 months." The temperature in the room dropped. Not literally, of course, but the change in Frith's manner was so abrupt that the effect was the same. His professional warmth contracted into something careful and rigid. "I am afraid that will not be possible, Mr. Holmes. Patient records are confidential, and in any case—" He paused. "I am afraid those particular notes have been misplaced." Misplaced. During the upheaval following Lord Ashcombe's death, my files were reorganized by a new clerk, and certain documents were not returned to their proper locations. It is an administrative failing, nothing more. Holmes regarded him with the expression I had come to think of as his clinical gaze. Not hostile, not sympathetic, simply diagnostic. "Dr. Frith," he said, "let me propose an alternative account. Lord Ashcombe's agitation in recent weeks was severe, far more severe than ordinary nerves. He was not merely sleepless, but mentally deteriorated. The bromide doses you prescribed were higher than standard, and the sedative tincture was stronger than you would wish a colleague to know. By the final week of his life, your patient was in a state of chemical fragility that made him acutely vulnerable to any additional shock, emotional, psychological, or otherwise. The treatment notes, if examined, would reveal this trajectory clearly. You did not misplace them. You destroyed them. Frith said nothing. His hands, which had been resting on the desk, withdrew slowly to his lap. "I am not here to prosecute you for malpractice," Holmes continued. "I am here to understand the condition of a man in the hours before his death. If Lord Ashcombe was already compromised by over-medication when the final letter arrived, when the stone was placed in his hand and the gaslight was turned low, then the margin between endurance and collapse was narrower than anyone knew. What you prescribed did not kill him, Dr. Frith. But it thinned the ground beneath his feet." Frith was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had lost its professional polish entirely. "I did not think it would matter," he said. "He was a man under strain. I treated the symptoms. The doses were, yes, they were higher than I would ordinarily recommend. But he was insistent, Mr. Holmes. He demanded something that would quiet his mind, and I gave it to him because he was Lord Ashcombe, and because one does not easily refuse a man of that standing. And when he died, I signed the certificate. Accidental death, a fall from a balcony while in a state of nervous exhaustion. It was defensible. It was not entirely false. But you knew it was incomplete. I knew that if anyone examined the treatment history in detail, questions would be asked that I preferred not to answer. So I removed the notes. That is the sum of my offence, Mr. Holmes. Vanity and cowardice, not murder." Holmes rose. "I believe you, Dr. Frith. You are guilty of treating your patient's status rather than his condition, and of concealing the evidence afterward. That is between you and your conscience, and perhaps, in time, the medical council." He paused at the door. "One more question. In your final visits, did Lord Ashcombe speak of anything specific that troubled him? Not general agitation, a particular subject, a name, an event?" Frith considered. "Once, perhaps a week before the end. He was sitting by the window, holding something, I did not see what. And he said, quite suddenly, 'I wonder if he received my letters.' I asked who he meant. He shook his head and said, 'A man I wronged, a man whose father I helped to destroy.' He did not raise the subject again. In the cab home, Holmes sat with his arms folded and his chin upon his chest. The rain had returned, and the streets of London gleamed under the gas lamps like the surface of a dark river. "The architecture is nearly complete," he said at last. "A man is weakened over weeks by anonymous letters that accuse him of a crime he knows he committed. His sleep is broken. His doctor fills him with bromides that dull the mind without quieting the conscience. And then, in the final hours, he is given a stone whose properties hold the eye in a state of fixation, a state designed to prevent him from looking away from the one thought that can destroy him. And the thought? That he deserved it. That everything being done to him was just." Holmes looked out at the rain. "That is the cruelest part of this method, Watson. It does not require the victim to believe a lie. It requires him to face a truth." He was silent until we reached Baker Street. Then, stepping from the cab, "Tomorrow I return to the records. I must trace the full history of the syndicate and identify Elias Vane, not as a ghost from the past, but as a man living in London now, under another name, with a workshop and a purpose. The stone tells me what he can do. The letters tell me what he wants. What I must now discover is where he's been hiding for 20 years. Chapter 7. The Thread That Binds the Dead. For 2 days Holmes vanished from Baker Street. This was not unusual. In cases of sufficient complexity, he would disappear into the city as though swallowed by it, moving through record offices, reading rooms, trade halls, and the particular underworld of clerks, archivists, and retired professionals whom he had cultivated over years, and who served him, for modest fees and the occasional favour. as an unofficial intelligence network more thorough than anything Scotland Yard could muster. On the first morning, he left early with no explanation beyond a request that I keep myself available, and that I not permit Lestrade to close the case in his absence. On the second day, a telegram arrived at 3:30. Have found the thread. Returning this evening. Keep the fire lit. S.H. He arrived shortly after 8. His coat damp, his boots muddied, and his eyes bright with the particular intensity that I had learned, over many years, to recognise as the look of a man who has seen the shape of an answer and is now merely filling in its lines. He threw himself into his chair, accepted a whisky, and began. I have spent these 2 days in the archives of Company's House, the Records Office at Somerset House, the Hatton Garden Trade Register, and 3 separate banking institutions whose clerks, I must say, are rather more susceptible to persuasion than their employers would wish to know. He drank. The picture is now complete, or very nearly so. The syndicate? The Whitmore Vane Syndicate, formally registered in 1873, a South African mining venture organised by Lord Geoffrey Ashcombe, who was then a younger and considerably more ambitious man than the one who died on a Belgravia balcony. The other partners were Sir Malcolm Drury, Alderman Horace Pelham, Colonel James Whitford, and Mr. Archibald Fenwick, 5 men of means and standing, pooling capital for a diamond prospecting enterprise near Kimberley. And the sixth was not a partner in the formal sense. He was the syndicate's consulting jeweller and assessor, the man whose expertise in gemstones gave the enterprise its technical credibility. His name was Absalom Vane. He was a jeweller with a shop in Cheapside and a reputation for precise, honest dealing. He was not wealthy by the standard of the other 5, but he was persuaded to invest heavily, more heavily, proportionally, than any of them, because he believed in the venture, and because the others assured him his risk would be shared equally. And it was not. It was not. The enterprise failed in 1874. The claim proved unproductive. The costs exceeded projections, and the capital was largely lost. At that point, the 5 wealthier partners retained solicitors and quietly restructured the arrangement so that the losses fell disproportionately upon Absalom Vane. The mechanism was legal, barely, and involved the reclassification of his investment from partnership equity to a form of guaranteed obligation, which meant he was liable for debts the others could walk away from. It was done over the course of 3 months, through correspondence and meetings to which Absalom was not invited until the documents were ready for signature. By the time he understood what had happened, there was nothing left to contest. That is monstrous. It is finance, Watson. The distinction is sometimes difficult to draw. Holmes refilled his glass. Absalom lost his shop. His home was seized to cover debts. His trade credit was destroyed. He appealed privately to each of the 5 men. I have found references to at least 2 of these appeals in old correspondence held by the Pelham estate, and each man offered sympathy, expressed regret, and did nothing. Absalom Vane died of a stroke in 1876. His wife followed him within the year, in circumstances of poverty that the parish records describe with clinical indifference. And the son? Elias Vane. He was approximately 30 at the time of his father's death. A trained lapidary, he had learned the trade from Absalom, and already known in Hatton Garden circles for work of unusual precision. After his parents' deaths, he continued to work for several years, primarily in optical instruments and custom lens grinding. He supplied observatories, surgeons, and scientific collectors. His reputation was excellent. And then, in approximately 1886, he disappeared. Disappeared? From the trade registers, from the professional directories, from every record I've been able to locate. Elias Vane ceased to exist, professionally, commercially, and socially, some 10 years before the first death in this series. Holmes rose and went to the mantelpiece, where a map of London was pinned to the wall with the 5 victims' addresses marked in red ink. He studied it for a moment. He did not leave London, Watson. He went underground. He changed his name, adopted a quieter occupation, and spent the next decade preparing. Somewhere in this city, a man who understands gems, optics, light, and the interior architecture of the human conscience has been living under an assumed identity, watching the 5 men who destroyed his family and engineering their deaths one by one. And the Sapphire? Acquired, I believe, through Bombay trade channels sometime around 1890, a Kashmir stone of exceptional quality, which he then cut and recut over many months to produce the optical effect we observed. The stone was his instrument, his seal. He sent it to each victim at the culmination of the letter campaign, and after each death it found its way back into circulation through intermediaries and the commercial orbit of Rajiv Nair's shop. Nair, I said. Then he is involved after all. Holmes turned from the map. Nair is a conduit. He handled the stone repeatedly and allowed its reputation to grow because it was profitable. He may even have suspected that human agency lay behind the deaths. But I do not believe he understood the full mechanism, and I do not believe he was a willing accomplice to murder. He is guilty of greed, vanity, and moral cowardice, considerable sins, but not capital ones. Then who? There is only one man in this case who possesses the knowledge, the skill, and the motive. A man trained in lapidary work and precision optics. A man who lost his family to the exact 5 men who have since died. A man who has been living quietly under another name, close enough to the gem trade to manage the sapphire circulation, and close enough to Nair to know when and how each victim could be reached. He paused, and I saw him weigh something internally. Not the deduction itself, which I believe he had already completed, but the question of how much to share with me. It was a rare hesitation. In most cases, Holmes laid his reasoning before me as freely as a lecturer before an audience. In this instance, he withheld. "You know who it is," I said. "I have a strong suspicion, but suspicion is not proof, and in this case the proof must be physical, workshop designs, letter templates, records of the Sapphire's movements, because the killer has taken extraordinary care never to be present at a death. I cannot arrest a man for being knowledgeable and patient. I must connect him to the instrument. Where will you look? I have already begun. One of Nair's account books records a series of small consulting payments made over several years to a Mr. Julian Ellsworth of Clerkenwell. The name struck me like a bell. The quiet old man in the back room, the steel-rimmed spectacles, the soft voice. Was he alone when he died? Ellsworth, I said. Ellsworth. Holmes sat down. A name that encodes rather neatly the ideas of worth and value, the very things his father was stripped of. I do not yet know whether it is Elias Vane, but I intend to visit his lodgings in Clerkenwell tomorrow morning, and I should like you to come armed. Armed? You think there is danger? I think there is a man who has spent 20 years perfecting a method of killing that requires no weapon, no violence, and no presence. Such a man does not plan for confrontation. But a cornered animal is never safe, Watson, and a cornered intellect is worse. He knocked the ash from his pipe and stared into the fire. A curse is only revenge made convenient to the imagination, he said. This was never a curse. It was a sentence I carried out with the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to take what he believed was owed. I slept poorly that night. The rain had stopped, and the silence of Baker Street seemed heavier than usual. I found myself thinking of Absalom Vane, the jeweller in Cheapside, the man who had stood in 5 offices with his accounts in his hand. asking for help that was owed and receiving only words. I thought of his wife, dead within a year, in conditions the parish had recorded without sentiment. And I thought of the son who had watched all of this, who had buried both parents before he was 35, and who had spent the next 2 decades fashioning, with the same precision his father had applied to gemstones, a revenge so exact that it reproduced the original injury in mirror form. 5 men, left alone, stripped of their defences, confronting a ruin they could not escape. I thought too of Ellsworth, the mild man in the brown suit, the steel-rimmed spectacles, the quiet voice asking a question whose significance I had entirely missed. I had sat across from him in Nair's shop and dismissed him in the time it took to note his appearance. He had been designed to be dismissed. That was the point. Holmes had said that the killer never needed to be present at a death. But he had been present at our investigation, sitting in the back room with the door open, watching us arrive, measuring Holmes with the careful attention of a craftsman examining another craftsman's work. It was, I thought, the most terrible patience I had ever encountered. And we were about to walk into the room where it had been forged. Chapter 8. The Man in the Workshop. The lodging house in Clerkenwell was a narrow, soot-darkened building on a street that had known better decades. The landlady, a Mrs. Busby, was a stout woman of 60 with suspicious eyes and a voice sharpened by years of managing tenants who paid late and explained poorly. She received Holmes's card with the wariness of a woman who understood that a detective's visit was rarely good news for a boarding house. "Mr. Ellsworth," Holmes said. "He occupies rooms here, I believe." He did. Gave notice 3 days ago. Paid through the month and left the rooms clean. Cleaner than most. A quiet man. No trouble. 3 days ago, Holmes repeated. I saw the calculation behind his eyes. 3 days placed the departure shortly after our visit to Nair's shop. Ellsworth had seen us arrive. I'd measured the threat and moved. Did he leave a forwarding address? He did not. Said his affairs in London were concluded and he would be travelling. I did not ask where. It is not my habit to interrogate a tenant who pays in full and breaks nothing. I should like to see his rooms. Mrs. Busby hesitated, but Holmes had already produced a half-sovereign, and her principles, such as they were, yielded to it. The rooms were on the 2nd floor, a small sitting room and a bedroom, both modest, both immaculate. The furniture was the landlady's, plain, serviceable, impersonal. Ellsworth had left no personal effects. The wardrobe was empty. The drawers contained nothing. The grate had been swept clean. It was the room of a man who had lived in it for years without ever truly inhabiting it, who had kept his real life elsewhere. "The basement," Holmes said. "Is there storage below?" Mrs. Busby frowned. "There is a cellar. Mr. Ellsworth rented it separately for what he called his optical work. I never went down. He kept it locked and asked that the maid not enter. I shall need that key." She produced it from a ring at her belt, and we descended. The basement workshop was another world. The cellar had been converted with the care of a man who understood precision. A long workbench ran the length of one wall, surfaced with polished slate. Above it, mounted on articulated brass arms, were magnifying lenses of varying power, each adjustable in angle and height. A lathe, small, finely made of the kind used by instrument makers rather than machinists, stood at the far end beside a rack of cutting tools so delicate they resembled surgical implements. Glass prisms were arranged on a shelf, each labelled in a small, precise hand, and on the bench itself, secured under a glass dome as though in a museum, lay a set of geometric drawings on heavy paper. Holmes lifted the dome and examined the drawings in silence. Then he held one up for me to see. It was a facet diagram, a schematic representation of a gemstone's internal geometry, drawn with the exactness of an architectural blueprint. Every angle was annotated, every plane was measured, and the overall shape, the specific arrangement of internal facets that would produce a particular behaviour under directed light was unmistakable. I'd seen it the evening before, pulsing under gaslight on our chemistry table. "It matches the sapphire exactly," Holmes said. "These are not studies of an existing stone. They are instructions for creating one. This is where the sapphire was designed, where its optical properties were conceived, tested and refined over what must have been months or years of work." He moved along the bench. Beneath the drawings he found a leather-bound journal, partially burned at the edges. Ellsworth had attempted to destroy it before leaving, but had been either too hurried or too reluctant to finish the job. Holmes opened it carefully. The journal was written in the same small, precise hand as the anonymous letters. Its contents, as Holmes read, selected passages aloud, revealed a mind of extraordinary discipline and terrible focus. There were entries on the behaviour of light through asymmetric faceting, notes on the duration of visual fixation under varying conditions of illumination, references to medical literature on fatigue, attention, and the susceptibility of the anxious mind to repetitive visual stimuli, and, toward the back of the journal, drafts of letters. Not complete letters, fragments, openings, tested phrases. Some were crossed out and rewritten. Others bore marginal notes. Too aggressive. He will dismiss it. More specific, use the date of the meeting. Reference the shop directly. He must know this is not speculation. The craft of the letter campaign was as meticulous as the craft of the stone. Each word had been weighed, tested, and placed with the same precision as a facet. Beneath the journal, in a locked drawer that Holmes opened with a pick, we found the list. It was a single sheet of paper, old, handled many times. 5 names were written in column: Sir Malcolm Drury Alderman, Horace Pelham, Colonel James Whitford, Mr. Archibald Fenwick, Lord Geoffrey Ashcombe. The first 4 names were crossed out with a single clean line each. Ashcombe's name was not crossed out. Beside it, in pencil, was a single mark. A question mark. Holmes held it up to the light. 4 certainties, he said, and 1 doubt. He was not sure about Ashcombe. Something made him hesitate. The remorse, I said. Ashcombe was trying to find him. Ashcombe was writing letters of apology. Yes, and Vane received them, or at least some of them. He knew that Ashcombe, alone among the 5, had begun to reckon with what was done, and yet Ashcombe is dead. He set the list down. The question mark is not mercy, Watson. It is the record of a conscience that arrived too late to govern the hand. We spent another hour in the workshop. Holmes catalogued everything methodically. The tools, the prisms, the journal fragments, the letter drafts, the facet designs. He found, in a tin box beneath the lathe, 3 envelopes addressed in the same hand to the same addresses Clara Ashcombe had found in her father's strongbox, the letters of attempted restitution, returned or undelivered. Vane had them. He had kept them. He read them, Holmes said quietly. He held them, and then he put them in a box and continued. We returned to Hatton Garden that afternoon. Holmes entered Nair's shop with a directness I had not seen in previous visits. The courtesy remained, but the patience behind it had been replaced by something harder. "Mr. Nair," he said, "I shall ask you a series of questions, and I would advise you to answer them fully. The man you knew as Julian Ellsworth is in reality Elias Vane, son of Absalom Vane, whose ruin was financed by the 5 men who have since died, in possession of a sapphire that passed repeatedly through your shop. You know this. You have known some part of it for longer than you wish to admit." Nair did not protest. He did not reach for charm or evasion. He sat down behind his counter and looked, for the first time since I had met him, like a man whose careful structure of ambiguity had collapsed. "I did not know his real name," Nair said. "Not with certainty. But I suspected, yes. The stone returned too regularly, always through channels that led back to him. He advised me on when it should be offered, and to whom. I thought it was commercial strategy. I told myself it was commercial strategy. And when the owners began dying, I noticed. Of course I noticed. But what was I to do? I had no proof. I had only a pattern and a quiet old man who understood gemstones better than anyone I had ever met. I told myself the deaths were coincidence. I encouraged the legend of the curse because it was profitable and because... He stopped. Because it was easier than admitting you were complicit. I was not complicit in murder, Mr. Holmes. No, you were complicit in circulation. You ensured the stone reached its targets. You preserved its legend. And you never asked the one question that would have forced you to act. Why does this stone keep coming back? Nair said nothing. Holmes placed his hands on the counter and leaned forward. You sold a legend. A Mr. Nair. Another man sold judgment. The line landed, and Nair flinched. Holmes collected the relevant pages from Nair's account books, the consulting payments to Ellsworth, the records of the Sapphire's arrivals and departures, and we left. On the pavement outside, Holmes paused and looked up at the window of the back room where we had first met the man in the brown suit. He has gone from here, Holmes said, but he has not left London. A man who has spent 20 years on a project does not abandon it, because a detective has found his workshop. He will complete what he set out to do, or he will be stopped. But Ashcombe is dead. The five are all dead. What is left to complete? Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. In the workshop, Watson, beneath the lathe, I found something I have not yet mentioned. A second set of facet diagrams, newer than the first, a fresh journal, barely begun, and a list of 3 names I did not recognize. I stared at him. He is planning more. The original 5 are dead, but a campaign of this nature, once it has become a man's entire purpose, does not end neatly at the borders of its original grievance. There were associates of the syndicate, solicitors who drafted the restructuring, bankers who facilitated the transfer of losses, men who were adjacent to the betrayal, if not central to it. Holmes turned and began walking. The machinery has not stopped, Watson. It has merely found new material. The afternoon had turned grey and cold. Hatton Garden emptied around us as the traders closed their shutters and locked their doors. We must find him, Holmes said, before the second stone finds its first owner. Chapter 9. A Mind Turned Against Itself. We returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon, and Holmes did not speak for the better part of an hour. He sat in his chair with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes closed, and the stillness that I had long recognized as the outward sign of intense interior work. The sapphire, which he had carried from Clerkenwell in his breast pocket, now rested on the table beside the fragments of Vane's journal and the list of 5 names. I did not disturb him. I busied myself with tea and the afternoon papers, though I confess I read nothing. The workshop in Clerkenwell had shaken me, not because of what it contained, but because of what it implied. After I had looked into the workspace of a man who had spent 20 years building an instrument of death, from nothing more than patience, paper, light, and stone, there had been no weapons, no poisons, no devices of physical harm, only diagrams, templates, lenses, and the careful geometry of a mind that had turned craftsmanship into execution. At last, Holmes opened his eyes. Watson, I owe you an explanation, not merely of the method, you have seen the workshop and can infer the mechanics, but of the architecture, the full shape of what Vane has done, and why the final death in this series is the one that matters most. He rose and went to the table, where he arranged the evidence in a line. The anonymous letter Clara had preserved, the burned fragments from Ashcombe's grate, the facet diagrams from Vane's workshop, the list of names, and the Sapphire itself. The method in its entirety is this. Vane identified 5 men who had conspired, legally but with full moral knowledge, to destroy his father. He spent years researching each man, his habits, his weaknesses, his private shames, his vulnerabilities. He then conducted, against each man in turn, a campaign of anonymous letters, not crude threats, not theatrical warnings, but precise, intimate, detailed accusations that forced each man to confront the specific wrong he had done. The letters were spaced over weeks or months, escalating from ambiguity to specificity, from suggestion to naming. By the time the final letter arrived, accompanied by the Sapphire, the victim was already in a state of sleeplessness, anxiety, paranoia, and moral collapse. And the stone finished the work. The stone sustained the state, under gaslight, in a darkened room, held by a man whose mind had already been turned against itself. The Sapphire's optical properties locked the gaze and prevented escape. The victim sat with the stone in his hand and with the accusation in his mind, and the two together held him at the point of maximum distress until his own temperament supplied the rest. Each man died differently. Precisely. Drury drank and wandered to the river. Pelham walked before a train. Whitford went to the Highlands and a narrow path. Fenwick took laudanum. Ashcombe opened the balcony doors. Vane did not prescribe the manner. He engineered a condition, guilt, isolation, fixation, and each man's character determined the outcome. That variability is what kept 5 deaths from ever being connected by the police. No two looked alike. The only constant was the stone, and the stone was dismissed as coincidence or superstition. He paused and picked up the list of names. 4 were crossed out in ink: Drury, Pelham, Whitford, Fenwick, with a single clean line through each. Ashcombe's name was marked only with a question mark. This is the heart of it, Watson, the question mark. Vane crossed out each man as the campaign concluded. But Ashcombe is not crossed out. He is questioned. Because Ashcombe repented. Because Ashcombe was the one man who did what none of the others did. He felt remorse. He wrote letters of apology. He offered restitution. He tried to find Elias Vane, not after the campaign began, but before it. For more than a year, our Ashcombe had been attempting to reach the man whose family he had helped destroy, to offer money, acknowledgement, and something rarer than either, genuine admission of wrong. Holmes crossed to the window and looked down into Baker Street. Vane received those letters. I'm certain of it. In the workshop I found a small wooden box, locked, which I opened. Inside were 3 letters in Ashcombe's hand, each more raw than the last. One of them contains the line, "I have deserved your contempt every year since 1874. These are not the words of a man performing regret. They are the words of a man who has lived with it." And Vane proceeded anyway. He did, but not in the same way. The campaign against Ashcombe was shorter, 3 letters rather than the usual extended sequence. Their language is colder, more uncertain, less savage than the letters sent to the earlier victims. I believe Vane hesitated. I believe, for the first time in 20 years, his certainty faltered. He intended to trouble Ashcombe, perhaps to force a public confession, perhaps to make him feel the fear the others had felt, but not necessarily to kill him. Yet Ashcombe died. Yet Ashcombe died. And that is the terrible irony at the centre of this case. Holmes turned from the window. The other 4 men required long, careful preparation because their guilt was buried. Drury was arrogant, a man who had rewritten the syndicate affair as a minor commercial disappointment and never thought of Absalom Vane again. Pelham was rigid, a man of committees and procedures who had convinced himself that what was legal was also just. For Whitford had rewritten the past in his own memory until the man he had helped destroy was a dim figure without a name. Fenwick had disciplined himself into numbness, the strictest routine, the most controlled exterior, all of it maintained to keep one thought from surfacing. Each man had built walls around his conscience, and Vane had to dismantle those walls stone by stone over months before the final instrument could do its work. But Ashcombe had no walls. Ashcombe had no walls. His conscience was already open. His guilt was not buried. It was active, present, tormenting him daily. He had been losing sleep not because of the anonymous letters, but because of the letters he himself had written and never received answers to. He was already in the condition that Vane's method was designed to create. The campaign barely needed to touch him. Holmes sat down. The Sapphire, Watson, was designed to hold a man at the point of his worst self-knowledge. For the other four, that point had to be excavated, dug out of years of denial and self-justification. For Ashcombe, it was already on the surface. The stone found a man who was already staring into his own mirror. It merely ensured he could not look away. I thought of Clara's account, her father at the dinner table, speaking in fragments about debts and settlements. I thought of Simmons, the valet, reporting that Ashcombe had said it was too late for settlements. I thought of Mrs. Fenton, who had seen him sitting motionless with the blue stone in his hand, so still she thought he had died in the chair. And I thought of Dr. Frith's account, Ashcombe by the window, holding something, saying quietly, "I wonder if he received my letters." He had, and they had not been enough. "The weapon worked best," I said slowly, "on the only man it should not have claimed." "Yes." Holmes's voice was quieter than I'd heard it in some time. "That is the crux. Vane built an instrument of exactness. He tested it against arrogance, rigidity, denial, and numbness, and it worked. But exactness, when turned upon a human conscience, cannot distinguish justice from cruelty. It cannot read remorse. It cannot spare the man who has already judged himself. The same mechanism that broke open the guilty broke open the penitent, and did so more efficiently because the penitent offered no resistance. Then it is murder. It is murder of the most unusual kind. Vane never entered Ashcombe's house. He never touched him. He never placed a weapon in his hand, and yet he arranged, with full knowledge and deliberate craft, the conditions under which a vulnerable man would destroy himself. The law will struggle with this, Watson. A jury will be asked to convict a man who killed with nothing more than paper, light, and stone. And patience. And patience. 23 years of it. He fell silent. I stared at the evidence on the table, the letters, the diagrams, the sapphire catching the late afternoon light from the window, and felt the weight of something I could not easily name. It was not admiration. It was not horror. It was the particular vertigo of encountering a mind that had devoted itself, with the full force of its intelligence and craft, to a purpose that was at once perfectly understandable and profoundly inhuman. The law prefers a hand, or a blade, a dose, a visible act, Holmes said at last. But there are men who kill by arranging a conscience and a silence in the same room. He rose and put on his coat. We must go to the Ashcombe residence one final time. The copies of Ashcombe's letters to Vane are there, in the strong-box Clara described. I need them as evidence, and then we must find Elias Vane himself. You believe he has fled? The lodgings in Clerkenwell are empty. He left shortly after Ashcombe's death. The landlady confirmed it, but I do not believe he has gone far. Holmes took up his hat. A man who has spent 20 years in a single purpose does not abandon the city where that purpose was carried out. He is in London. He is waiting. For what? Holmes looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen. Not certainty, but something closer to its opposite. A detective confronting a case in which the moral landscape refused to resolve into the clear lines he preferred. "I'm not entirely sure, Watson. Perhaps for us. Perhaps for something he has not yet decided." He opened the door. "Come, we have one more night's work before this is finished." Chapter 10. The Artist of Death. Holmes traced the trail through a dealer in optical glass near Southwark, a specialist who remembered selling rare blanks of flint and crown glass over several years, to a quiet gentleman named Ellsworth, who paid in cash. The dealer recalled him as precise, courteous, and unremarkable. From there, Holmes followed a second thread, a property record from the Cheapside Parish Archives. The shop that had belonged to Absalom Vane had stood empty since 1878, and changing hands twice before being purchased in 1889 by a private buyer, listed as J. Ellsworth. No renovation had been recorded. We arrived at dusk. The shop stood at the end of a narrow lane off Cheapside, a low, dark-fronted building with boarded windows and a door whose paint had cracked and peeled until only fragments of its original green remained. Above the door, barely legible beneath decades of soot and weather, a sign read, A. Vane, Jeweller and Lapidary. The letters were nearly invisible. Holmes studied them for a moment before trying the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and carried the faint mineral smell of stone dust and old wood. The shop floor was empty, stripped bare, the display cases long removed. But the rear had been maintained. A workbench stood against the back wall beneath a shuttered window. Upon it were tools, a jeweller's loop, precision files, calipers, a small lathe, and a collection of glass prisms that caught the last light and scattered faint rainbows across the bare walls. And at the bench, seated on a plain wooden stool with his hands folded in his lap, was Elias Vane. He did not look up when we entered. He sat in the posture of a man who had been waiting, not with anxiety, but with the settled patience of someone who has reached the end of a long labour and has nowhere further to go. He wore the same plain brown suit. The steel-rimmed spectacles rested on the bench beside him. Before him, on the workbench, lay two objects. The first was a sapphire, not the one Holmes carried, but a second stone, smaller, unfinished, its facets only partially cut. Beside it was a sheaf of paper, drafts of letters, in the same small, precise hand, addressed to no one I recognized. Holmes saw them at the same moment I did. "A second stone," he said quietly. Vane raised his head. His face was calm, older than I remembered from Nair's shop, the mildness replaced by something more austere. He looked at Holmes the way a man looks at a colleague whose arrival he has long anticipated. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he inclined his head. "You have been thorough. I did not expect it to take you so long, but I did not expect you to miss the workshop either. Shall I save us both time and tell you what you already know? I know a great deal, Mr. Vane, but I should prefer to hear it from you." Vane nodded. He did not rise. "I killed them," he said, or rather, I arranged the conditions under which they killed themselves. The distinction may matter to a lawyer. It does not matter to me." His voice was level, the voice of a man delivering a report on completed work. "My father was Absalom Vane. He was a good man and an honest tradesman. In 1874, 5 men who had invited him into their venture betrayed him, and when he asked for the help they owed, they refused. He lost everything. He died of shame and exhaustion, and my mother died of poverty. I was 30 years old. I had watched the whole of it, and I decided that each of those men would one day sit alone in a room and understand, truly understand, not merely know, what they had done. And so you became patient. I became exact. I studied each man for years. I learned his habits, his fears, his vices, his secret shames. I wrote to each one as though I were his own conscience given a pen. And when the letters had done their work, I sent them the stone. My father's craft turned to a different purpose, and I left them alone with it. You never entered the room. I never needed to. A man who has been made to see himself clearly, Mr. Holmes, does not require an executioner. He requires only a locked door and enough silence. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the letters, Ashcombe's letters of remorse, the ones he had recovered from the Clerkenwell workshop. "You received these," he said. The change was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. Vane's composure did not shatter. It thinned like ice over dark water, and beneath it something moved that he had been holding in place for a very long time. "I received them," he said. "Ashcombe wrote to you. He offered money. He offered public acknowledgement. He admitted what was done. He begged your forgiveness. He did. And you proceeded." Vane was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its steadiness for the first time. "I nearly stopped. That is the truth, Mr. Holmes. I reduced the campaign. 3 letters instead of the usual course. I made them colder, less detailed, less personal, because I could not bring myself to write to him the way I had written to the others. I expected distress. I expected confession. I expected him to go to the police, or to his solicitor, or to his daughter, and to make the matter public. I did not expect him to die. But he did. He did, because he was already broken before I touched him. The others required months. Ashcombe required days." Vane looked down at his hands. "I gave him a mirror, and he was already looking into one. The stone only held him there." "And the second stone?" Holmes gestured to the unfinished sapphire on the bench. "The letters beside it. They are addressed to men who were not members of the original syndicate." Vane did not deny it. Associates. Solicitors who drafted the restructuring. A banker who refused Absalom's appeal for emergency credit. I had begun to think, after Ashcombe, that the original 5 were not the boundary. The boundary of what? Of responsibility. Of complicity. He paused. Of guilt. Holmes's voice was sharp for the first time. "And where would it have ended, Mr. Vane? If we had not come, 6, 8, 12? At what point does an instrument of justice become an appetite?" Vane flinched, a single involuntary contraction that passed across his face like a shadow. At that moment his hand moved toward the unfinished stone on the bench, a reflex perhaps to destroy it, perhaps from instinct, perhaps from something I could not read. I stepped forward and caught his wrist. He did not resist. The stone remained where it lay, half-formed and dull, a weapon that had not yet learned to kill. Holmes picked it up and placed it in his pocket alongside the first. "You built an instrument of exactness without compassion, Mr. Vane, and exactness, when turned upon a human conscience, cannot distinguish justice from cruelty." Vane looked up at him. "I gave them nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing but a mirror." "No, Mr. Vane. You gave them a mirror and chose the light in which they must look. The room was very still. The last of the dusk had faded, and the only illumination came from the open doorway behind us, where the gaslight from the lane cast a long, pale rectangle across the bare floor. Vane did not rise. He sat on the stool in his father's shop, among his father's dust, and I saw in his face not defiance and not surrender, but something between the two, the expression of a man who had completed a great work and discovered at its conclusion that the work had completed him as well. He had nothing left. The purpose that had sustained him for 20 years was finished, and beyond it there was only the silence he had designed for others. Holmes sent me to the lane to summon a constable. When I returned with a uniformed officer, Vane stood without being asked, submitted his wrists to the handcuffs, and walked out of the shop without looking back. The case resisted ordinary labels. The press called it the Sapphire curse, and treated it as Gothic spectacle. Lestrade filed a report that satisfied his superiors without satisfying himself. Nair was questioned and released without charge. Clara Ashcombe received her father's estate under the revised will. Haley was dismissed. Frith was referred to the medical council and quietly retired within the year. Holmes retained the Sapphire for several days. I found him once, late at night, holding it up to the gaslight in our sitting room, not with fascination but with the detached attention of a man examining a mechanism whose function he understood completely and whose existence he nonetheless found troubling. On the fourth day, he surrendered it to Lestrade with a terse note. Evidence. Do not display it. Whether Lestrade heeded the instruction, I do not know. And I asked Holmes, some weeks later, whether he believed Vane would hang. I doubt it, he said. He killed no one with his hands. He administered no poison. He wielded no weapon the court will recognise. A clever barrister will argue that the victims took their own lives, and a jury of 12 Englishmen will find it very difficult to convict a man of murder by letter and lamplight. He paused. Whether the law can punish him is one question. Whether he has already punished himself is another. I thought of Vane in his father's empty shop, sitting among the remnants of a trade that had been stolen from a good man and turned, by that man's son, into the architecture of death. I thought of the 5 solitary rooms, the 5 silent falls, the 5 men who had died holding something blue and beautiful and terrible. And I thought of Ashcombe, the one man who had tried to make amends, the one man whose conscience needed no excavation, the one man the instrument should have spared. He had written letters that were never answered, offered restitution that was never accepted, and died alone in the dark with a stone in his hand that held his gaze while his courage failed. Holmes never spoke of the case again, but I noticed that for some time afterward he kept the curtains in our sitting room drawn open wider than was his habit, as though he wished to ensure that no corner of the room remained in shadow, and on those evenings when the gaslight flickered, as gaslight will, he would glance at it once, sharply, and then look away.